Okay, so we left off with the futurists with the last video who were very pro-war, and now we're going to talk about the Dada movement, D-A-D-A, Dadaist, who are actually the opposite. They were horrified by war. So because of that, they turned to studies on the unconscious and the subconscious. So with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, that's where they turned their attention. Now, the Dadaist or the Dada movement is going to be the precursor to the Surrealist movement, which is also going to embrace Sigmund Freud as well as Carl Jung, which are both psychoanalysts. Now, Freud really developed a focus on the physicality of connections on a subconscious level, and Carl Jung was very much about more what are called archetypes or connections on a cerebral level between people. And that there is what's called a collective unconsciousness that all humans are connected to. So the dreamscape is going to become very prominent as a point of interpretation for the surrealist. But before we get there, let's talk about one Dada artist in particular. And one real quick thing is that the Dada movement was very much about art as a healing and a healing element from all of this warfare that was going on, and also self-revelation. So figuring out essentially who you are as a person and using artwork to do that. Now, to discuss more of the horrific aspects of war and how the Dadists saw that, Duchamp, D-U-C-H-A-M-P, is going to do something called the use of ready-mades. He's calling them ready-mades, R-E-A-D-Y-M-A-D-E, ready-mades. And so we're going to look at his piece, Fountain. Let me get my PowerPoint up here. And it's going to be figure 29.26. Now, when you first look at this, you're probably like, that's a urinal. That's because it is. And so this is what we're calling a ready-made, based off of the Dadaist idea, Duchamp in particular, that war is so horrific, why even create? It's kind of pessimistic in a way, but then it's going to lead to a very healing property, well, especially into the Surrealist movement. And Duchamp was under the belief, why create something new when war is going to come in and destroy it ultimately? So it's a social commentary on the consequences of war, the outcome and the symptoms of war. So what he did is he took this urinal, he lifted it up onto its side, and then called it a fountain. And it has a lot to do with an unconscious or a subconscious impetus as well. So let me explain real quick. Now, we're not going to talk about the Dada movie that much because we're going to focus more on the Surrealist here in just a minute. So he would find these objects, they're found objects, and then he would modify them and then essentially say, why produce new objects when war will destroy them? So just go find something that's already out there, modify it. And then what that does is it forces folks to see art in a new light, meaning that it's more about the conceived idea of what art is versus the formulated conventional design of art. So making you question, well, why isn't the urinal considered a piece of artwork by the family that actually, I think it was the Motte family, M-O-T-T, that designed these urinals during the time? Why isn't that considered art versus whenever he would take it, flip it on its side, put it in a museum, and then it's considered art? So he's making you question, why is this? Why, I mean, and it ultimately comes down to it's the thought, the subconscious or the unconscious thinking that develops these conscious thoughts that make you decide to do what you need to do with objects, and in his case, objects that were already in use or that were found. So it's very much about playing that level between a conscious thought and what gets to that conscious thought of awareness on what makes something classified or termed as or defined as art versus what's not classified or termed as art. So it creates what's called conceptual art. So this is the beginning of what's called conceptual art, meaning it's the thought or the conception of how to use the object versus like, okay, I need to use a canvas, I need to use a stretcher, I need to use wood, I need to use a gesso, I need to use paint, I need to use a brush to make a piece of artwork called painting. Here, it's something's already made, it's been detritus, it's been tossed away because of the advent of war. I'm going to take it, I'm going to change it, flip it on its side, I'm going to write a name on it that associates with the producer and the production company, hence the R MUT that's written on there, that relates to the industrial machine of making these casted urinals, and then I'm going to call it art. Okay, so it's the conception of how to take objects, arrange them in a way to be considered art, conventional or unconventional. In this case, it would be unconventional at the time. But today, something like this is actually considered a conventional avant-garde piece of art. All right? So that is the layering of the Dadaists, which will ultimately become the unconscious and subconscious layering of the Surrealist. But they'll dive deeper into their dreams to emphasize what is art, versus here it's more of that space in between those deep layers of dream and into the cognitive or conscious thinking. So it's all about conception and cognition. So again, very mental, and you got to realize that with Freud and Jung in the scene, it's all going to be very much about these deep areas of self revelation inside of you that Duchamp is embracing with Fountain. Okay, so I know some of these schools might be a little like, what is going on? There's a lot going on, and I don't expect you to get everything right away, but just train yourself on being open to what's happening at this time versus maybe comparing it to something else very quickly. Kind of dismiss the comparison as much as you can, because there's so much happening, so many different waves of thought are developing on how people it used to be, it would be a big group of folks, a big group thinking in a similar way on how to react to a situation. Now it's a smaller, more finite group, like the Dadaist or the Cubist or the Futurist, and these different schools of thought. And then ultimately, as we get further into the book, like into chapter 32, it's going to be about how the individual sees what the world is doing around him or her. So we're slowly moving into the ego of the individual, and now these little schools are becoming smaller and tighter versus they used to be much bigger, hundreds of years back. So now we're going to talk about another school of thought coming out of Germany in response to warfare, and the German-led warfare of the Great War in particular. We're going to look at figure 29.34, and we're going to look at Dix, D-I-X, and hold on a second. Yeah, D-I-X. And this is Der Krieg, which is the war, German for the war. And this group is called the Neue Sachlichkeit, Neue space Sachlichkeit. And essentially that means in German new objectivity. New objectivity. And the reason it's called the New Objectivity Movement is that they all in some way served the German army during World War I. And what they wanted to do and what they desired is to show a direct and honest image of the world from a war perspective, from what they experienced in the army from the war. All right, it's a very specific group that comes out of Germany that had some direct association with being a German war. A German soldier during World War I. And the reason it's so heightened and elevated during this time, especially in the book, is because these are people that actually served with the German army and they became artists afterwards. and they wanted to depict what they felt was going on in the ranks of the German army. So here we go. So with Dix's Der Krieg, he saw the effects of the Great War, and he tried to show what are called dialectics, a dialectic between procreation and death, as well as building something up and tearing it down, and then growth and decay. It's almost a little synonymous to the futurist, where they saw the advent of war necessary for a cleansing, and here with this group, the new objectivity, new objectionist, if you will, they were trying to balance out like life and death, building, tearing, or construction, deconstruction, growth and decay. They were trying to find a balance, but the more the war carried on with Dix, he said, screw it. I'm not going to try to discuss these new objectionist kind of views. You need to see exactly what the heck is going on the ground. So with the war, Der Krieg, it's based off of this wanting to show this balance of life and death, but then the war became so overwhelming that he's just like, yeah, this war just is not a good idea. And so that's what this is. This is a derivative of that. So it is a triptych, so that triptych, which means it's 3 parts, very much like the altarpieces that we saw, like with the Eisenheim altarpiece by Grunwald. So it's playing that same kind of panel design. And he's trying to show what war does to humans and the terrain. So you can see to the far left, the soldiers are marching in. Then you have the complete devastation in the central panel. And then there's an apparition self-portrait of him to the far right, trying to help a soldier out of the warfare, almost as if he's going back and locking into the scenario to hope that he can at least save somebody. Because in the very bottom of the altarpiece, there is either sleeping or dead soldiers buried down low in the trenches. And the reason he did the altarpiece is, again, he wanted to show, like a new objectionist, the balance between life and death, and he had all intentions on showing that procreation can come from this death. The phoenix can rise from the ashes, growth can come from decay, and that was his intention. But then, like I said, the war kept persisting and he changed that all. So it was meant to be like an altarpiece that connected with the Eisenheim altarpiece in the past, which was about seeing hope and salvation with biblical images of Jesus's pastimes. That was the original one by Grunwald. And that was his intention, to show like there's going to be this rebirth and this this salvation and resurrection of hope and truth. But unfortunately, the war kind of diluted him. And so now it's all about there being no resurrection at all. And it's all about this decay. And it's all about this this defeat. And it's all about this kind of tear down and death and decay. And ultimately, that's where Dix ended with Der Krieg. All right. Okay, so now let's, so I needed to include that real quick, but now we're going to jump into Surrealism based off of the Dadaism that we just looked at. And so let me break down because there's actually 2 different types of Surrealists. There's not just one. Figure 2939, we're going to look at one Surrealist, whom you may already know as Dali and the Persistence of Memory. So let me break down what Surrealism is all about. So the Dadaists moved to the Surrealist movement. All right, they became Surrealists, like I already talked about. And what they wanted to do is show dreams in the unconscious world. Okay, and again, the Dadaists were all about going into the unconscious state to focus on healing and self-revelation. And here, the Surrealists want to go farther. They want to go into your dreams and interpret those dreams. And Carl Jung was actually a dream interpreter. So he was a psychoanalyst where you would go and speak with him, and he would tell you what your dreams actually meant and how your psyche is affected by the world that is around you. And the Surrealists were improvisational, like Duchamp was, but they focus their impromptu techniques by showing fantasy coming from it. So has a lot to do about fantasy. And again, Jung and Freud were big psychoanalysts and psychologists that were behind a lot of the manifestos of the surrealists. So, and the surrealists, again, like the futurists, began as a literary group, like a written form, and they created manifestos, writings, like intellectual writings that dealt with these ideas and these ideas of thought. And then these painters like Dali and a few others came into the scene to visually reinforce some of these written manifestos. And they believe that dreams connect human consciousness beyond the surface of activities, and that what happens on a daily basis on a conscious or cognitive level isn't it. It's just the surface. What's going on inside is creating levels of activity that are going to ultimately be revealed later. And these painters, these surrealist painters, were looking at tapping into that early so they can heal from something that might be a reactionary in the future. So their paintings are an avenue to bring that out and to pull that out. So that's why they did what they did, for healing purposes, like originally the Dadaists were all about in regards to the wars that were happening, healing from warfare. So there's two types. There is a naturalistic surrealist, and what they do is they metamorph the scene, the imagery, but they make it recognizable. They have different parts within the composition or the painting that is somewhat recognizable. So Salvador Dali is a naturalistic surrealist. And then the other is a biomorphic surrealist, which makes painting automatic and automatism, meaning that art is being made without any conscious control. So you're just doodling and you're just quickly making and developing things without any connection of thought. Essentially, your hand becomes an extended tool of your subconscious level, coming out of that almost dreamlike state. And a lot of biomorphic surrealists, well, surrealists in general, as soon as they come out of their dream state, they start painting right away. All right, so that they're directly connected with their what's called a slipstream, or that dream state in between being in a deep dream and actually being conscious in the external world around you. It's called a slipstream, and they're connected to that. All right, and Miro, M-I-R-O, is going to be a biomorphic surrealist. So let's talk about Dali, and let's talk about another naturalistic surrealist called Magritte, and then also Miro. All right, so with Dali here, persistence of memory, it's supposed to be an allegory of empty space, like in a dreamscape, where time is really ended. So there's no sense of A through Z or from noon until 1. It's all, time becomes very irrelevant. And there's amorphous objects, just like something is quickly shifting in your dreams that can take on a certain form and then it can metamorph and change into another form. So the naturalistic surrealists were very much about metamorphing images, and an amorphous shape like we see there in the middle center that has a clock that's melting over it. An amorphous shape is a derivative of that metamorphic shift, all right, from one object to another. You may be dreaming about, something, and then suddenly it takes on a different form. Like my girlfriend, for example, was dreaming about a dog that turned into a child and vice versa. So it like takes on a different metamorphic state, and that's called that's called amorphous in nature. Amorphous. It doesn't have like one true objective shape. It's changing. And also, and here time leads to decaying of an organism. So it's kind of playing on the concept of what time really is all about, and kind of wanting to deconstruct the relevance of time, and that if you emphasize time so much, that's why he has it pitted here 4 different times. Actually 5, because the sun is never truly setting. It looks like it's getting ready to set on the horizon, but it never does. So this persistence of memory of time, and that it ultimately leads towards these elements of decay. And the reason why he would create these contrasting shifts between something that's really organic and something that's losing its organic quality and is moving towards death and decay, and the symbolism behind that, and the symbolism behind the decay, is we have different clocks that are melting and the time has suddenly stopped. You also have the fly and also the gathering of ants on one of the time clock pieces, which are actually symbolic representations of something being broken down, something being decomposed. So something that's often being decomposed, you'll see flies swarm around it, you'll see ants breaking it down, and also other elements of decomposers. But the reason he would show that in contrast with the super organic and more of the landscape is because it was Dali's goal to make the irrational concrete, which is something that has to do with the study of the unconsciousness, like with Carl Jung, is to take something that seems fragmented and irrational in a dream state and somehow make it recognizable and concrete so that you can heal from it. Whenever you can create something cognitively concrete based off of what feels emotionally irrational, then that's when you combine the two and you're able to therapeutically step forward and heal. And that's very much about what the surrealists and the naturalistic surrealists were all about. And then we got another playful one here, figure 29.4, with Magritte, the treachery of images. This one is a total divergent from Dali altogether, but it's still considered a naturalistic surrealist painting. You would look at it and be like, yeah, but it's just a pipe, and it's got some French words, on the bottom. Now let's talk about it and why it is. So first of all, we got a new term called trompe-l'oeil, which is French for fool the eye. And Magritte was very much about making this pipe look super, super realistic, almost like you could grab the pipe, and it would be in your hand. And there's a reason for it, to make and play off of this surrealist idea. And trompe-l'oeil is spelled Trompe space L asterisk OEIL. I'm sorry, apostrophe L apostrophe OEIL. Trompe-l'oeil, to fool the eye. All right. Now the reason he wanted to fool your eye is because he wanted to play with semantics and the play between what is considered unconsciously an object and what's considered a label. So as a surrealist, he's actually using literary elements, which originally was what surrealism was about, was these literary manifestos. And so he's going to use terminology in the bottom under the pipe to kind of make you question semantically if this is a pipe or not. And how he does that is the writing in French underneath the pipe is literally says this is not a pipe. So by saying that, it makes you unconsciously think, why is this not a pipe? Yes, it is a pipe, but then it is not a pipe because it is a painting. So he's doing that intentionally to make you think beyond the boundaries of the painting. And he painted it in this super realistic trompe-l'oeil fashion so that it really makes you believe that it is a pipe by making it look super real. But then he tells you it's not a pipe with semantics. And that's actually the truth. And the whole point is to get you deeper in your thinking process in an unconscious way to go, oh yeah, that is a pipe. But then to question, oh wait a second, that is not a pipe. So keeping you in these layers of cognition that are deeper than just on the surface. Because it is just a superficial rendering of a pipe. It is not a pipe. And he is telling us that. So playing with your mind a little bit through semantics to make you tap into your unconscious thoughts of what is actually real and what it actually is not real. So that's what makes him a naturalistic surrealist painter. All right? So a little different than Dali. And now let's look at a biomorphic surrealist. Figure 2942, Juan Miró, called Painting. And it's biomorphic surrealism. And then if you remember what that is, it's automatically drawing, painting without any cognition at all, almost in a very aloof state. So really trying to just tap into the pure emotions and energy of that subconscious or unconscious realm. And it's all about fantasy. And then what Moreau would do, he would use chance, meaning that everything that he made wasn't necessarily embraced or liked in the public eye, but he really wanted to stick with that biomorphic surrealism of just doodling and going and drawing and painting without any real connection. So how he would do that is he would randomly doodle, right, on the canvas, and then he would create motifs and then reshape them. So he would doodle, and then if he liked one of the doodles, then he would take that shape and replace it and break it up and reconstruct it somewhere throughout the composition, almost like a cubist attempt. And so it starts with the first stages of being completely unconscious and really sometimes not even looking at it and just doodling directly on the canvas. And he would always place these shapes in a floating environment of immaterial background. So it doesn't have any connection to landscape, interior space, exterior space. It's all floating in this almost void-like realm of color that is supposed to be a reflective of the unconscious. But he did ultimately go and say that there is a conscious element to this biomorphic painting where it starts super unconscious, but then he would have to consciously decide what objects he needs to use and move around the canvas. So he actually is showing the healing process of going back and forth between the unconscious and the conscious and tying them together. And the painting is the consolidation and the amalgamation of the unconscious and conscious awareness that he has as an artist. All right. So let's look at what's going on in sculpture real quick. We're going to look at three. We're going to look at Brancusi, we're going to look at Hepworth, and we're going to look at Moore. So start with figure 29.46. And with sculpture, it's actually going to be a counter to what's going on with the mechanisms of war, as well as modernization and industrialization at this time. And what the sculptors during in between 1920 and World War II, 1940, is what they're really going to focus on is abstraction instead of reproduction. And they felt that by abstracting a sculpture, it takes away from the idea of reproduction. And reproduction is very much has to do with industrialization. So they want to get away from the idea that something needs to be reproduced. So they focus on abstract in the sculpture to emphasize the importance of one individual piece of artwork versus the idea of reproducing it over and over again, which is called a mechanism, is repeating something over and over again. So with Brancusi here, Bird in Space, what he really wanted to do, what he was all about the essence and rhythm of the form. And it had nothing to do with the external element at all. He wanted to encompass the organic elements and the essence, almost like the soul behind the sculpture, and create a rhythm, a pulsing rhythm. Like you see, it starts at the very top, very narrow, and points, and then it opens up and inflates. Then it narrows down again almost to a point, and then it opens and slightly inflates again before it hits the plinth or the base that it stands on. So by doing that, he's creating a rhythm within the form and the mass of the form, and that creates the essence and the organic essence of its abstraction versus trying to hide it and make it repetitive in pattern. He wants to create a rhythm, almost a mood, which has a lot to do with abstraction. Then we have Hepworth, which is figure 29.47, and she alongside Moore, which is figure 29.48, are going to be very similar in nature. And they're wanting to focus on a few main factors. One is called mass and giving mass, and the mass is supposed to be a reflection of the greater nature that we all live in, the mass of the world, the mass of the earth in which we walk through. All right, so that's why they're focusing on mass. So if you look at both figure 29.47 and 29.48, there's a lot of solid mass. In Hempworth oval sculpture number 2, the white is a lot of mass. In Moore's reclining figure, the wood, the elm wood, where it's brown and you see all the different designs in the wood, is the mass. So it's very much about the mass reflecting nature and the organic quality of nature. All right, so really getting away from the industrial machine is what they're all about. Then they want to create an inner tension. And the reason they create an inner tension is, again, the psychology that we have whenever we're surrounded by nature, whenever we're surrounded by something that's organic. And the tension that that we may get from that. Now, that tension doesn't have to be a negative connotation. It could be that tension on where do we belong in this. So both Hempworth and oval sculpture and reclining nude or reclining figure with Moore have burrowed holes throughout this natural mass. So those burrowed holes are meant to be these negative or empty spaces on where our mind can reside in nature and find a place of relaxation and peace in a realm of extreme tension. Okay, kind of pulling on the object. So that's why they would use what is called inner tension. And then rhythm and scale, just like what Brancusi did in Bird in Space. They're very much about trying to find a rhythm throughout the overall vast scale of the pieces. All right, so from the scale of the different holes that are burrowed into the objects, creating that inner tension and that empty space, to the mass and positive elements of the actual elm wood that we see in Moore's reclining figure and the plaster cast that we see in Hepworth's oval sculpture. So the rhythm between the empty space and the positive space. So the empty space is the open areas that create a tension between different components of the positive material, which is the mass of the plaster with Hempworth and the wood with Moore, right? Creating a tension and a rhythmatic connection between the two. Okay, that is chapter 29.